at your apartment. I couldn't talk to you again about it this morning.
Yeah, Mr. Harriet and I went down to Harper's Ferry.
We went in there last night to take out this battery that had shot down these two planes. And we destroyed some buildings and maybe had a partial success in taking out one of the guns. The Secretary of State, the Secretary of Defense, and the Joint Chiefs all felt like that after they shut down two planes that we had to make some response. If we didn't, why we just destroy ourselves. So we did that, and our planes came back uninjured and all back at their base.
Well, you heard Lyndon Johnson himself. We're getting ready to run this strike. So we got to show these communists the United States of America means business, and we're going to use this Super Sabre and the wingmans to do it. You heard the assessment from the man at the top in the real mission. All the F-100s came back safely. Ironically enough, you'll see as we taxi on, was actually able to do quite a bit of damage, but I'm not sure we were able to check the box fully on all the planes coming back unharmed this time. But you're going to see me play this mission in the F-100, and you're going to see if just see how close we get to the real world results here. So incidentally, one of the fun things about this aircraft, and it's something that's shared with the F-4E as well, is it's just so much fun to taxi with the canopy open. On some of the modern jets, I think you can't actually do that just because of the stress limitations and whatnot, but you can in the F-100, and this is pretty cool. You know, you feel like you're just taxiing along in a big old, muscle car or whatever. It's really a nice little vibe. So we're taxiing down to, or I should say back taxiing to get ready to take off here. Something I'll point out about the F-100 that usually isn't an issue on some of the later fourth generation stuff is that because you're dealing with 10,000 pounds of ordnance or 10,000 pounds of thrust, I should say, and 16,000 pounds in afterburner, and this is an airplane that can get up to 30,000 pounds of ordnance. You're looking at you got to be careful with what you carry versus the runway you're taking off from, because it's very easy to overload the jet and find yourself running out of runway before you get in the ground full or get in the air fully. So just a note for those of you who are planning your sorties: if your runway is big enough, like Nellis or something, this isn't a big deal. But if you're taking off from smaller fields, you might not want to go with full fuel and full snake eyes, right? Because you might have some trouble getting in there. Closing the canopy, getting ready to fly this mission. It's kind of interesting how you appreciate the details on these modules more when you fly them in quasi-realistic circumstances. Multiplayer has its place, and I'm not going to be one of these people that comes in and says it's bad, because it's not. But I feel also like you don't really get to know a module when you spawn in, fly around, blow something up, and then leave, right? When you spend 2.5 hours in the aircraft, you get a real sense of the simulation, you get a sense of the vibe, you get a sense of like what the vibe and the feel and the detail really matters for. And it's just, to me, it's a bit more engaging and more memorable and more mentally disciplined and stimulating than just hopping in a jet and doing ace combat stuff for like 15 minutes and then signing off. Again, I don't want this to be misconstrued as some kind of rant against multiplayer. It's just, to me, I find real meaning and importance in flying these airplanes, especially these historic airplanes, in more grounded, realistic circumstances. It also paints the picture for why we live in the world we are today, where we've got all these smart bombs and guided munitions and all these technological features, because a lot of this innovation came about from lessons paid for in blood. And we've been so removed from time, from this era when we had no choice but to dive on the target and get into the AAA systems and everything and really mix it up one-on-one, Wild West style from the air, you know. Nowadays, you would not do this in an F-15E or an F-16 or MiG-29 because you just don't have to, right? The technology is there to keep you from the AAA batteries and the bad guys' guns, but none of that technology existed in 1964. So it was basically just go out there, hurl your jet and your ordnance at the ground, and use some heavy application of luck, calculations, and prayer to get rounds on target. So as we're cruising over to the combat zone, we've got a full load of 500-pound low drag bombs and 2 fuel tanks. One modification I did make on this mission versus the real world sortie is that I'm using the 335-gallon tanks versus the 450. One of the reasons that the U.S. Air Force went with the 335-gallon tanks eventually is because the drag on the 450s was just so much that it really didn't matter, because even though you had more fuel, the fact that the tanks were draggier than the smaller drop tanks meant you really weren't coming out ahead. And the 335s were a little bit more reliable when you punch them off, and that's important because if you have to punch the tanks off, you don't want to have to question the viability of the tank ejection function, right? So taking a look at number 2, props to Granelli for fixing that bug. In this flight, his pylons are suspended with actual metal pylons and not the force of Hogwarts. So props to that team again for fixing that. It's a heartening thing to see when the dev team actually supports the product in a rapid and engaging way instead of it just kind of being pushed out into early access and then left to rot. That's always kind of the closet fear a lot of people have in the community, and I'm glad to share that this is not a concern with the Granelli folks. They're a very passionate group of folks. This is not just a commodity product for them, and that much is very clear after having spoke with them at this year's Flight Sim Expo 2026. So a great group of people, and I look forward to seeing what other changes and upgrades they do with the F-100 over the coming years. So also worth noting that compared to the F-4, the F-100 is almost a marvel of fuel economy, which is a strange thing to say about a tactical fighter, but this is a sortie that requires one way about 500 miles. Obviously, we don't have a Vietnam map, so I can't really show it one-to-one. I had to plan the distance using the South Atlantic map, but liberties aside, the distances that I'm flying in the sortie are very close to what were done in the real one, so I had to plan the fuel and the ordnance exactly the way the real pilots had to, and it really opens your eyes to the more important things that don't necessarily find their way into forum chats. Like, forum chats are all about, you know, they're all about turn rate and thrust and power and all the dogfight stuff, but fuel economy is one of those things that's going to make or break your tactical capabilities, because it doesn't really matter how well you can fly the plane if you have no gas. And the F4, especially on the longer strike ranges, you would definitely get some range anxiety, even with external tanks, because the more you got into the afterburner and maneuvered, the less gas you had, and the less gas you had, the more worries you had about getting home. So sending 2 off to go hit his target. In the real sortie, they hit 2 separate sites, so that's what we're doing here. Although also in the real sortie there were more aircraft involved. The real flights had about 8 F-100s, 2 flights of 4. For CPU management and graphics card preservation reasons, I'm not doing that. We're just scaling the fight down a bit so we can keep the focus on just the 2 of us. So I put 2 targets on the map representing the 2 sites that were hit. One of which, of course, was the Siang Kuhang site, which you saw in the intro, and the other one was a base that essentially represents some buildings that number 2 is going to hit. My plan originally coming into this was to hold high over the airfield. We don't have to worry about SAMs here. It's just AAA, so I could just stay above the AAA range and then wait for 2 to do his thing, have him form up, and then we'd go to my target. However, coming back to the topic of fuel, I have used the fuel in my external tanks. There's a little green light that comes up on the telelight panel when you use up your external fuel. There's also some external fuel quantity gauges down by your feet near the rudder pedals. So those are 2 ways you can check your fuel state with the externals. And the flight from Da Nang up to the target area basically used up the fuel I had in the externals. So we're on internal gas now, and the goal now is to just basically stay out of afterburner. Fortunately, the Super Sabre doesn't really need afterburner. It's helpful at times if you want to like increase your speed on an attack run to dodge AAA or something, but unlike the Phantom, where you basically need it to be an afterburner all the time to get the most out of it, the Super Sabre is still fairly maneuverable even on just military power. Another point in the Super Sabre's favor is you can initiate the afterburner at any point in the throttle, which is a really convenient thing. It doesn't, again, one of those things, it's not on the spec chart. You don't generally think about it like, oh, you can turn on the afterburner at 50% throttle. Like, why would that even be a big deal? Well, if you're trying to gain speed because someone's shooting at you with the AAA, it's kind of nice to just go instantly into afterburner and not to have to move it all the way to the top of the throttle quadrant and then go into it, right? It may not be a lot of time, but that amount of time to just punch the button and go, it is such a capability that I'm really appreciating in the Hun, and I wish other airplanes had, even though obviously this is a 70-year-old warbird that has 70-year-old throttle mechanics. I still love the fact that if I want to just go fast, I don't have to push the throttle somewhere to do it. I can just press the button, hit the afterburner, detent, and go. So owing to my fuel state, I'm not going to hang out and wait for 2. That was my original plan, but the fuel situation's kind of forcing me to change things on the fly. So I'm going to proceed to the target area and send 2 back. Much as I would like him to go pound some other AA sites, I want him to get back alive this time. So I am sending him back, and it's kind of funny how the psychology of being a flight lead plays out here. Obviously, again, number 2 is just a bunch of pixels, right? But I still feel a sense of responsibility to make sure he gets home and safe and sound. So I'm not going to expose him to a lot of fire, and it kind of gives an insight into why some flight leaders might be a little restrictive when it comes to letting their wingmen do certain stuff, because an ethical leader is going to have a certain level of like responsibility to making sure that nobody goes home gets shot down and ends up a POW or in a body bag. So that sort of responsibility can override letting someone off the leash to gain their tactical skills a bit. So thankfully, since Stash 2 is a bunch of pixels, I don't have to worry about getting yelled at after the sortie. So and besides, if he does have a problem with it, it doesn't matter because I outrank him. So perks of the job. We're gonna head to our primary target. I already set up the bomb settings off camera, since it's not difficult, but there is some effort involved. You do need to set your spacing and whatnot, turn off the external tanks there. It does involve some settings. You have to go into the armament panel, flick some switches, and you have to go into your quantity, set that. Set your pylons. You got to make sure all this stuff is dialed in the way you need it to as well, because if you miss a switch or miss a step, you can easily just do a pass and then have bombs on your airplane without realizing it. Or you do your pass and you have the wrong switches because you have the switches for your rockets, but all your modes are in the bomb, so you press the pickle button, nothing happens, and it's because you got your rockets selected, but your sights and your armament switches are in bombs. So to me, it's not terribly complicated. It's actually pretty simple versus some of the more like computer screen intensive tasks or some of the process flows in like an F4 or something, but it is something to bear in mind when you're doing air to ground in the jet. Another logistical point to make here is navigation gets pretty interesting in the F-100D because there's no moving map, there's no GPS, there's no digital assistance. It's all based on how well you understand the mapping of the area and how you structure your navigation aids. So all I can say on this point is spend some time on the F10 map before you jump in the mission and plan how far away you are from your take hands, how far away you are from major features, navigate by landmarks, navigate by all these things, because again, you're not going to have the benefit of a moving map in a MFD and a color screen that'll show you exactly where you are at all times, you know. And it's kind of interesting. Some of the challenges that many F-100 pilots had wasn't with the tactics, it was just getting across the Atlantic Ocean during a fighter coronet movement. And for those who don't know, a coronet is when the U.S. Air Force moves jets from one continent to another, which happens depending on mission needs. This happened in 1958 when some F-100s needed to go from Seymour Johnson to Lebanon. And let's just say things got kind of hairy. A couple of maydays were called. Some guys diverted to places they hadn't planned to divert. Weather got in the way. Tankers didn't show up. It was kind of a story. And I might actually make that into a sortie video in and of itself, because even though you would think air-to-air refueling is not a terribly exciting topic, when you're flying an airplane that has no moving map display or onboard navigation besides your maps and dead reckoning, that can get pretty spicy and get spicy real quick. So I'll have to see if the maps and DCS are even big enough to allow a representation of that. But yeah, that's quite a story, and it just goes to show you how technology makes, you know, without the technological aids that we're used to, even basic stuff like getting from point A to point B can be pretty hairy in an old school warbird like this. So getting visual tally now on the target. Another tip for those of you flying this jet in air to ground, one of the reasons why it was mostly used for level deliveries is because when you're turning it at low speed and high angles of attack like this, you have to still use the rudder just like you would when you were landing the jet. If you roll in on a target and you get negligent and start using the stick, you can depart and go into adverse yaw just like you would on the ground on landing. So low airspeed, high angle of attack, just because you're carrying bombs doesn't mean you get a pass on adverse yaw. Wish it worked like that, it doesn't. So the primary solution a lot of Hun drivers enacted was to just deliver bombs level. It's one of the reasons why you see a lot of content oriented to just level delivery, and why you see a lot of historical footage of Hun drivers flying it to straight and level and just laying napalm or snake eyes or cluster bombs on targets, because that way you didn't have to worry about adverse yaw pulling up. You could just, you know, fly level, hit the pickle button, and as long as your numbers were on reasonably close, you'd hit the target, and that's that. So, because diving, well, it has its risks. And yeah, we just got hit. Crap. Let's start doing some checks. I move the stick, kind of shift the rudder a little bit to test if we have some good maneuverability. Almost said visibility there. Looks like the jet's flying okay. Nothing's leaking or burning. We don't have any smoke. The engine's still running, so we're gonna keep going. This is another reason why the profiles usually like to be level delivery, because if you're flying level at 400 knots, it's pretty difficult for a AAA gunner to snap their guns up, get a bead on you, and shoot. At this point in history, F-100 crews weren't really doing that because most F-100 crews hadn't really had a lot of practice with air-to-ground stuff yet. We have to remember also, this is 1964, so the U.S. Air Force at this point in time had gotten away from a lot of the standard combat skills that had been honed over Korea and World War II. So classic dogfighting was actually illegal. You couldn't even get into a dogfight without risking your wings getting pulled. And conventional delivery was something that had been dropped from a lot of curriculum and syllabuses because the U.S. Air Force brass literally thought we would never fight a conventional war again because World War III would be all nukes. So that's what the doctrines and everything were structured to, which meant conventional rocketry, conventional gunnery, conventional air-to-air, as we know it today, was just not done. Most of the flight time was oriented to the basics of flying the jet and conducting nuclear deliveries. And that meant that a lot of the crews that went to Southeast Asia like this were figuring it out on the job. They hadn't done a lot of gunnery practice, and unfortunately a lot of the losses that happened early on were because of that. So training matters. And again, I'm not trying to make the point that these guys didn't know what they were doing completely, because they did know the basics, but they hadn't drilled it to quite the extent you would expect of, say, a modern fighter squadron that is constantly practicing conventional weapons delivery, because that just wasn't the mindset of the U.S. Air Force at this point in history. So rolling in here. I have to say that doing dive delivery in the F-100 is much easier than the Phantom, because even though the F-4 has the dive toss capability, it's a lot easier to control your angle of attack, and your guns are pretty much right on the dot. So I do a little bit of a side strafe there. The F-100 is also a lot more maneuverable at lower airspeed and at lower altitude than the F-4. So while in the F-4, if you want to correct for a pitch or a side-to-side error, you have to do a bit more. And since you're just flying this huge sled of a jet, it's a lot harder to slow down when you're in the dive. So you don't have nearly as much time to correct and get accurate hits on target as you can with something like this F-100D, where once you get it in the dive, you're pretty good. You're good to go. Alright, looks like we're getting some good hits on target. As I was saying, the F-100 tracks really nicely in a dive. And, as mentioned too, the guns are a particular treat because you get 1,000 rounds total, 200 among 4 guns. And you have the armament option to select top pair and bottom pair. So you end up with a nice dynamic where you switch to the top guns like I'm doing now, and you can run those dry and then after switching those off, you can switch to the bottom pair and then run those. So you've got your choice of whether you want full fire density or half fire density, and for most cases, at least this one, you can get the job done either way. Kind of nice versus the Vulcan, where it's 6,000 rounds a minute all coming out at once, and whether that's what you want or what you don't want, that's what you're gonna get, you know. Also worth noting, again, when you roll in with a dive bomb pass, make sure you're using the rudder. Don't use aileron when you're at low airspeed and high angle of attack, especially with the payload, because that will cause problems. I know it's something that's been said before, but I will restate it again because it's a very easy thing to forget when you're thinking about your dive profile, your fusing, what you're shooting at, especially when you're dealing with AAA. Ugh. That's just never comfortable. Tecumseh Sherman said, war is hell. We got good BDA on the target, so we are RTB. Interestingly enough, we're actually did a bit better on this sortie than the actual pilots did in the real life strike. They only did partial damage, as President Lyndon Johnson stated in the tape earlier. In this case, both me and the wingman managed to get pretty much most of the areas we targeted. So that goes to show you just how effective the Hun can be in a ground attack role. Note also that by no means am I an expert in this airplane in terms of flight hours. I've got 13 at the time of this sortie, so not even a full day's worth of experience in this plane, and look at the damage that BDA shot showed. So yep, I'm looking forward to getting good at this jet. So lining up for landing, the plan here is to do a 1,500 foot, 2,000 foot flyover the base at about 300 knots, make my turns, and then complete an orderly and very boring landing. Haze makes it a little bit of a challenge, but no biggie. Just managing the approach here. Again, very important in this jet that because you don't have an onboard navigation system, that you do your pre-flight planning the best you can. Make sure you've got distances to your navigation waypoints and take-ends written down or recorded somewhere. You have a tablet, piece of paper, something like that, and make sure you have that information handy, because it will be needed when you are doing longer duration sorties like this one. It's not, of course, a big deal in multiplayer, but when you're doing these kind of interdiction strikes, navigation details matter. Good to see the two made it back safe and sound, so things are looking up. And we'll make our turn here. Put a little bit of rudder into the plane. Oh. It's at this point I realized that the battle damage I took earlier might have been a little bit more than superficial. I put the nose down because the jet is not responding in yaw, and now I'm trying to work the stick to see if maybe that's the issue, but she's just not responding, and now I've lost rudder authority as well as elevator, and there's no time to resolve the problem, so time to pull the handles. Out we come. Chalk one up for the golden BB, folks. That's how quick the sugar can turn to shit when you're doing this. Sorry, President, didn't bring your plane back. Thanks for watching. We'll catch you in the next one.